Hi there, my name is Jeff and I'm an amateur at work. For my first video slideshow, I'll be making a prototype sword out of layered foam board. Since I truly am an amateur, this slideshow will be very basic and will focus more on the process I had in creating this foam board sword more than anything else. To preface this project, I first came up with the idea for this sword after reading the novel Noble Beginnings by D.W. Jackson. The story follows the character of Doran, the son of a duchess in a fantasy kingdom. Young Doran has been training his young adult life away in the hopes that one day he can be a soldier. But there is unrest in the kingdom, and he and his family will have difficult decisions to make. If you haven't read it already, and I highly recommend that you do, then I suggest you do so now, because in order to explain the design of the sword, I'm going to have to talk about some spoilers. So go ahead, pause the video here, and go give it a read and come back whenever you're done. All finished? Good! So once Duchess Thea declares Farland's independence to the king, and prepares to face off against his army, young Doran comes up with the symbol that the newly founded queendom will reign under. Upon choosing the 2 blue moons, I began to think of how this new heraldry might be incorporated into uniforms and armaments, and came up with the idea for an arming sword that could be carried by those within the Queen's Guard. My first couple designs ended up looking a little goofy. I mean, it's tricky to work 2 spheres into a design that is still functional. But finally I decided on a design that incorporated the 2 moons but had them layered on top of each other for a simpler but still potentially effective design. As you can see in these preliminary sketches, I designed the hilt to have a crescent guard that would align with the scabbard so that when sheathed, the 2 would form a whole circle, symbolizing the moons. And when the sword was held, the 2 crescents would be the mirrored phases of the moons, and the scabbard would also show the other mirrored phases of the moons. After flipping and overlaying the various portions of the circles, I had my design. Now on to the materials. As I said before, I'm a pure amateur, so my tools and materials were as basic as my skills. For this build, I had my 3/16 inch thick foam board, a box cutter with many replacement blades, a combination square, a compass, several types of glue, a pencil and eraser, and an actual short sword for reference. First things first, I used my reference sword to get an approximate scale for the foam sword I'd be making. I laid the sword down on some scrap paper and traced it out, and then drew a circle with my compass at a size that I was happy with. Now came the fun part of cutting a circle out of foam board with a rigid knife. I knew that just freehanding it could work, but I wouldn't be too happy with the results. So instead, I decided to draw a hexagon around the circle and cut it out that way. Once the hexagon was freed, I could cut smaller and smaller portions off of the sides until I got enough roundness to satisfy me. After that, I had to size the crescents to my liking. Now, since my compass is rather small, I couldn't get the right size for my cutouts, and I ended up looking around the kitchen for something that had the right size to get me the shapes I needed. Eventually, I settled on a plate that I had lying around near my computer. I know, I'm such a slob. And with that, I had my shapes. In order to cut these out, I had to freehand them, since I couldn't think of another way to keep the circles usable while cutting the shapes out. So I took a deep breath and got cutting. And after only a few swears, I had my moons. Next, I set up what would be the foundation for the crescents and the blade. Now, I'll mention here that I made a mistake that I would later regret. When I drew this out, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for a grip, as I had a couple ideas and wasn't sure which would work best just yet. So I left some material where the grip would be and figured I'd just attach it somehow later on. The bad part was that later on, I had trouble attaching that grip and it would have worked so much better if I had just included it in this cut, but oh well. Anyways, I once again used my reference sword to get the size of the blade and got to cutting, using both my combination square and freehanding the tricky bits. And soon enough, I had a blade. Using a rare stroke of good intuition, I waited to glue all the pieces together and pin things into place where I needed them, just in case I had to reset a piece to fit into a future cut. So the next task I tackled was the scabbard. This part was simple enough, as I just had to use those other pieces of the circles left over after the crescents with the shape that fit over the sword I had already cut out. And since the shapes were hopefully symmetrical, I just cut it out twice and flipped them. I quickly learned that I didn't actually cut them perfectly symmetrical and had to do some minor adjustments to get them to sit just right. Then I cut out the inner part of the scabbard that would give the sword the space it needed to fit. After some more measuring and cutting, I was ready to glue the scabbard pieces together. Thankfully enough, the blade fit in with only a little bit of friction between the pieces, so I was ready to finish up that grip. My first thought was to make a grip that folded into shape by cutting out angular pieces along those lines. This proved to be a little too annoying to do, so I settled on making two identical pieces that would slide into each other to make the grip. This was much easier than the previous method, and a lot faster. So I set up the crescent on the blade and got ready to attach the grip. It was here that I realized the mistake I had mentioned earlier, and so this is where the glue comes in. After applying a layer of regular school glue, the grip wouldn't hold enough to even swing the sword around. Since I wanted this thing to be really stuck together, I tried to use some liquid super glue to make a strong outer shell. And while it kept the outsides of the foam board stuck together, it had the unfortunate side effect of melting the inner foam and weakening the board overall. Frustrated by this, I turned to a hot glue gun to save the day. I used it to fill in the new gaps and gave the outside another layering just to make absolutely sure that it wouldn't come off. Finally, I got the grip firmly attached to the blade. At this point, my build was complete, but I felt it lacked a little in the looks department, partly because of my haphazard gluing. So I grabbed black and blue markers and started to color in the two moons. This really helped to highlight the different layers of the sword and scabbard and show off the phases of the moons that I had designed the sword for. I did the sides in opposite colors to draw out a little more as well. And with that, my Queensguard sword was complete. Here are a couple of shots of it in action, though the foam sword was no match for the cat that haunted me while I was working. Overall, this was a fun project as it let me design in layers and have separate interlocking parts that fit together fairly well. I hope you enjoyed watching this build, and I hope you read the rest of the works by D.W. Jackson, because I sure have to in order to see if there are any more notable items that I can make out of foam. Thanks for watching!